This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality.
Henry mashed his cigarette into a tinfoil ashtray. It was full of tar, stinking butts. He crumpled the ashtray closed and, squirming against the passenger door, stuffed the smoldering lump into his jeans like a carcinogenic pocket warmer. A mid-60s wind blustered through the front cab windows of the Ford blue truck. I was staring at the Polaroid camera shuddering on the dashboard. Our reflection was faint on the lens, a miniature silhouette, the three of us seated side by side. We were on our way to Sandy Mush, a green mountain valley with old road beds leading up to hidden, steep slopes. About a 35-minute drive northwest of Asheville, North Carolina. Derek was driving with a fixed grin and one hand slack on the steering wheel. Wireframe glasses, freshly shaven. He always smelled of Speed Stick by Menon, original scent. You'd find no butts in his ashtray, the tray fully extended, loaded with coins and magnails for land surveying. There was still a charred whiff of Henry's butts clinging to the air. Derek looked past me to glance over at him. "That bake full of butts ever set your leg on fire?" "Not yet," Henry said, his brows cramped resolutely behind his black-framed glasses. He seemed to be welling up with paternal pride over the lump in his pocket. I joined in. "You packing that stink-butt egg when you're teaching Comp 101? "Packing? No. Open carry." A shard of sunlight flared off his glasses. He continued with a nick of slobber building in the corner of his chapped lips. "I show it to them day one. Tell them, you've got to keep your butts if you're a smoker. Just like you've got to keep your vague pronouns and dangling modifiers if you're a writer." There was still an after-image shard of sunlight swimming inside my eyeballs. Henry grabbed onto a fistful of air. "See, it's all about waste management, proper disposal. You can't just go flicking your butts to the curb. You gotta bring them home, flush them down the toilet." "What about the vague pronouns?" I said. "The dangling modifiers?" "Those you don't flush." He looked to the middle of the road as if in the distance was a troubling presence staring back at him. Then a private thought seemed to crack behind his eyes. He sniffled through the hairy sprigs of his nostrils. His voice became jittery and emotional. "Behind every vague pronouns, an investigation waiting to happen." Then his eyes, bagged with insomnia, sharpened. "It's all about the waste you write and learning how to follow its lead." I was still thinking of Henry presenting that eggful of cig butts to his students. "So, you stink up the classroom like that? At an adjunct level? Man, that's balls. You sure it's not balls you're feeding us? Come to my class and find out." "That might be awkward," I said. "Why?" He straightened his glasses. "I think you know why." Henry was teaching at the same college where we had all met, and he and Derek had stayed to graduate, and I had dropped out over 8 years ago. "Who gives a shit about that?" Henry said. "You could audit my class, sitting back next time I give my spiel on waste management." Think I just got front row. I wiped a speck of Henry's spittle from the side of my cheek. He popped another Winston cigarette in his mouth and struggled against the wind cutting through the window to fire it up. Eventually he prevailed, puffing on his cig with a Unabomber's fervor. We blew past an automotive store with Gossett's Grocery coming up on the right. "Anybody need anything?" Derek asked. "Last chance. Only thing I've got on my property is spring water." I tongued a scrim of lard and a crumble of spicy sausage from the rear of my mouth. We'd all just finished takeout biscuits from Bojangles. All good, we all agreed. Then we shot past Gossett's grocery, and I looked out onto a battered single-wide trailer. There was a large plywood sign propped against a Ryder mower in the front yard. An advertisement for Y2K canning supplies. The wording neatly stenciled in airbrushed black. Prepare, prepare, prepare. Can what you can. Y2K. The day is nigh. Nigh as in still a year and a half away. We all agreed that a potential global meltdown over a glitch in 2-digit code was a bunch of hooey. Either way, Derek and Henry were prepared. Not with some hideaway cave stocked with jelly jars of pickled okra, green beans, and yeast for probiotic beer, but with a stockpile of their own firearms. Well, Henry only had 2 firearms, an AMT hardballer and ASM DT amphibious rifle, a 90s classic from the Soviet Union. He was ready to barricade himself in his woodfin home if it came to that. But Derek, he couldn't even keep up with his arsenal, his most recent purchase being a Heckler & Koch grenade launcher. He'd often talked about joining the Army, but you'd think he'd already served. He was a proud member of the NRA and would years later defer his steady progress toward becoming a licensed land surveyor, leaving the small company he worked for as a theodolite operator to enlist as a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division. Then it would be off to Iraq. Derek and Henry seemed to have a grip on their future, backing it up with firearms. My future wasn't as clear as any of that. Working banquets at the Grove Park Inn, ballroom parties, country club weddings, convention buffets, and between shifts, pantry room naps in a dead sector of the hotel, a bottom shelf for a plankboard cot behind a row of gargantuan cans of stewed tomatoes. There was a time you'd get enough drinks in me and I'd probably bring up my filmmaking aspirations, but the shelf life on that had expired. I trashed all my Super 8 films after having them transferred onto a VHS tape. A series of short 3-minute reels. But then apartment living on the dark side of a mountain can add a fuzzy green funk of mold to just about anything, my treasured cassette included. Then there was the night after work I invited a ballroom dishwasher to my place to show him my movies. And the VCR just chewed the tape up and spat it back out like squid ink spaghetti. It's possible I could have fixed it by winding the tape back into the cassette. But we'd been drinking Warthog gin, and the Warthog said, "Go and get your hammer." Stan the dishwasher shielded himself as I destroyed both the VCR and the cassette. I smashed them up good, cassette chips flying, ribbons of magnetic tape on the hammer jostling like a pom-pom. Stan hugged me after that, with a manly clap across my back, and then looked at me with amazement in his eyes, as if he'd just witnessed something far superior to anything I could have ever screened on my television. Truth is, you can only watch your own productions so many times before they start failing you. The destruction was justified. I remember him driving off that night in a souped-up Corolla, a shiny little beast, cherry red, with performance flywheels, high-revving camshafts, and a tailpipe that needed fixing, hanging as it scraped along the asphalt, often sparking like a match scratching to be lit. If I still had my Super 8 camera, I'd have probably asked him to let me use that car in one of my movies. That Corolla had character. Stan, not so much. Another bump in the road, and I was catching Derek's Polaroid camera as it hopped off the dashboard onto my lap. An instant camera. He said he'd loaded it that morning with a fresh pack of film, I guess you could say I was striving for a comeback of sorts with Derek's help. What we were setting out to shoot that day wouldn't be a motion picture, but a series of photographs I could lay out on a coffee table like tarot cards, or a scattershot storyboard to a single scene. I asked Derek what I owed him for the film. He winked at me, said it was on the house. Just give me a production credit. How about producer? That'll work. He rocked a fist. Then I could hear the shovels jittering from the truck bed. I started gnawing on a fingernail. You look nervous, Henry said after scrubbing a flick of ash into the thigh of his grubby jeans. You ready to die? I smiled back at him. Yes, sir. But I'm not so sure my smile was all that convincing. My former film projects, the ones I'd revised with the hammer, often involved depictions of myself killing myself. Gunshot spatter on the wall, a sway of legs kicking midair, a plastic bag on my head with the hyperventilating suck coming to a concave end. I preferred black and white film where the blood was easy to make with Hershey's chocolate syrup. But this would be in Supercolor 635. Not that the film quality was what had me nervous, but that Derek and Henry were going to be burying me alive. It's hard to say if my art was evolving or devolving from death simulations to death approximations. This wasn't going to be a scene in which a corpse would be buried by his killers. I'd been thinking of this more as a Jacques Cousteau of the dirt. Those pantry room naps behind the cans of stewed tomatoes at GPI, that's where the vision had first appeared. Newton had his apple, Buddha his Bodhi tree. Now I would have my dirt. Before Derek and Henry came to pick me up that morning, I'd taken apart my Red Devil vacuum cleaner for parts I'd use as my communication and breathing apparatus. The red flexible tubing for hearing, and the adjustable steel pipe for breathing. The noose, the pistol, the insecticide cocktail that had me rabidly foaming at the mouth. Those had been campy and fun, macabre films to make. But this? There was a quaint country house, and out in the yard a portable table stacked with fresh ramps for sale. The honor system, $2 a bunch. Maybe we'd stop by on our way back. You could smell them, too, the atomic bomb of the onion garlic world. Eat a ramp raw, and your pits will stink for a week. Derek was talking up a patch of ginseng he'd found in the upper climbs of his land, where we were headed. The mountains deep in the valley, where all roads end. I returned to my hangnail, gnawing as I sang under my breath with a melodic twang. The opening lines to Slayer's South of Heaven. The steep incline of switchbacks along the gravel road leading to the heart of Derek's property abruptly ended on a long and narrow lot. We were in the middle of 28 acres of forested land, the mountain continuing to rise to the right. Shutting the truck doors, we stretched our legs, backs, and arms. The engine ticked as it cooled down. A lush smell of green trees and vegetation permeated the air, akin to skunk. Most of the trees were tall and healthy, chestnut and scarlet oak, hickory and poplar. A few short and stumpy, pawpaw and sassafras. But it was the taste of mountain air, rich as a moist cake of loam, and the fiddlehead ferns waiting to be snipped, buttered, and pan-sautéed on the red-hot nautilus of an electric stove that had me wanting to burrow into the earth like a man-sized worm. Astride the weed-whacked lot was a firewood log pile, topped with an expanse of 3 blue tarps. The sides of the stacked and quartered logs left exposed for the greenwood to season. All of it had been chainsawed and assembled from what had been cleared to make the road. Derek pointed to where soon he would start building a single-room cabin. Then he pointed back down the road, mentioning a sun-bright area we had passed where he planned to put a house. They grabbed the shovels from the truck bed. I followed with the parts I'd removed from my Red Devil vacuum cleaner. Derek already had a plot in mind, leading us up a path only his eyes could track. Only 10 steps climbing dirt, root, and stone, and I was already out of breath. I stopped to spark up a smoke, opening the pearl snap breast pocket of my blue western shirt. Pack in hand, I tamped out a lucky strike. This would be my last cigarette before my friends buried me. The first puff was dramatic, but not enough for Derek to take a picture. We continued our upward hike for at least 1/10 of a mile. Then, with a sweep of the boot, Derek started clearing a spot on the ground. Henry helped him as I sucked on the last of my smoke. Then I scraped the non-filter out against the craggy face of a nearby boulder, feeling compelled by Henry's presence to store the butt in the cellophane sleeve of my dwindling pack of Luckies. Now, more present than the smell of the surrounding damp forest was the stink of black ash. It was still on my fingertips from having stubbed out my last smoke. Henry jabbed the shovel into the dirt. This was the first picture Derek took. He placed it on an oak stump to slowly develop. I could see the image starting to appear in a milky dissolve of chemical ephemera. Then I hobbled as I pulled off my sneakers and socks, pants, underpants, shirt, and undershirt. This was going to be a naked affair, except for the saran wrap I was going to duct tape over my face and groin. I wanted all holes covered, except for my mouth and one ear. Then I stepped up to the grave that with each shovel load continued to deepen before me. The wind blew over my naked skin. It was chillier than expected. I jumped in place, warmed my hands. Then I started covering my groin, biting off strips of duct tape to adhere the clear wrap to my upper thighs and waist. They continued digging with an automated pace, switching out now and then to work the pit one at a time. I wrapped my face tight enough to smash my nose. I tore holes in the plastic over my mouth and right ear. I taped the wrap where it ended on my neck. The job was done, and soon they were done too, standing there, hands relaxed on the grips of their shovels. My friends looked blurry and somber through the shrink wrap, like an antique portrait of gravediggers. I stepped up to the edge of the pit, sensing its depth, 3 to 4 feet deep. There was more than enough room for me to lie comfortably on my back. Henry stabbed his shovel into the earth. It stood alone as he stepped up to me like a bunny rancher with a hand-bolt gun. Playfully, he nudged the twin barrel of his fingers against my temple. "You ready for this?" I nodded yes, and he offered me a hand, which I accepted by the wrist. Something I'd learned from Derek, telling me once how movies are full of shit, that a hand won't save anyone from falling from a rooftop or a cliff. You've got to grab them by the wrist. I think that's what had him squinting with a smile from behind the viewfinder. Another flash, another photograph discharged from the mouth of the camera. The dirt was surprisingly cold. I held the steel pipe upright with the base of it duct taped over my mouth. Henry pinned the tube leading down to my ear to the outside of the pit with a birch log. I gave them the thumbs up. Derek took another picture. Henry started shoveling. Then they both shoveled. Dirt thumped onto my chest. I shut my eyes. They picked up the pace, goading each other on to see how fast they could accomplish the job. All sense of daylight quickly vanished, and the pressurized build of dirt amassed over time until it felt as though Henry and Derek had decided to sit on my lungs. That's when the shoveling stopped. I could hear them thwacking the ground flat above me. I imagined the shapes of the spades being imprinted on the dirt, an abstract collection of geometric lines. Henry must have crouched to the ground. His voice sluiced the length of the accordion tubing, filling my ears as if booming into an empty chapel. "How you doing down there?" I could hear Derek chuckling behind him. Fine, except for the ringing in my ear. I didn't want to tell them how heavy the dirt was against my chest. That'd probably rile them to test the ground above, see if by boot pressure alone they could crack a rib. "Well, give us a shout if you need anything. We'll be back after a while." "Wait, what?" "I've got some things down at the woodpile to check." This wasn't something I'd anticipated. I'd always figured they'd wait until I was ready to say I'm done. Maybe they were joking. "How long will you be gone?" There was only the soft white noise of the wind whistling down the tube. "Guys?" Nothing. My next breath tasted like burnished steel. It was easy to imagine the carpet dust and grime that had sucked up the length of this pipe at a high velocity. I tried flexing my right hand. I couldn't even move my fingers. Okay. You've got this." The air in the tube was starting to turn stale, yet it was cold enough to evaporate the moisture from the back of my throat. My uvula already starting to feel raw, a soreness that sharpened with every breath. How stupid I'd been to think the dirt would be toasty as a sleeping bag, when now the earth was working fast to distribute the core of my body heat elsewhere. The bottom of my foot itched. A muscular spasm was threatening to turn into a cramp in the small of my back. Was it possible that I was beginning to breathe more carbon dioxide than oxygen? I was waiting for the tingling sensation of passing out to arrive. But the stark hold of the dirt continued to keep me ice cold and alert. Then a fleck suddenly appeared on the back wall of my throat. I coughed, unable to swallow. The next several heartbeats jumped into my head. I had no idea how far the pipe extended. Could it be that they buried it flush with the ground so that a strong wind could, with great ease, sideswipe a handful of dirt down into the pipe? I coughed again, enough for the fleck to hop like a flea. Then I could taste it on my tongue. It wasn't dirt, but a caraway seed from the sausage biscuit that morning. I could see the biscuit in my mind's eye like a buttermilk muppet laughing at me hysterically. "You're gonna die." The earth was in on it too, starting to suck the heat from my bones. Then came the out-of-body experience, warped as a wide-angle lens. I could see the ground I was buried in, a curvature of dirt surrounding the pipe driving straight down into a crooked show of teeth. I was there. I was nowhere. I was awake. I was asleep. I was there for a minute. I was there for an hour. It was dark. It was bright. I was breathing. Was I breathing? My throat was burning raw. I was ready. Was I ready? Ready for what? That's when Derek said smile, and I could sense the electric blue light from the flashbulb piping down into my mouth. And it would look like a picture from the afterlife. My full set of teeth like some unwieldy thing, barely visible down in the pipe. The photograph mildly opaque with an ectoplasmic hue. That without context, simply made for a crappy weird picture. One I would absent-mindedly leave with $1 tip at the Waffle House after wolfing down a country ham dinner along with some of the dirt that spilled from my hair. Henry would waddle ahead of us after that meal as if on the brink of exploding. We'd all had the same dessert, a slice of southern pecan pie, while reviewing the pictures Derek had taken, pictures I would keep after he laced them up in a bow tie of hazard orange flagging from his land surveying kit, except for the one I'd left behind, which I can still see, sitting there beside the salt shaker and napkin dispenser. Derek offered to turn around so I could go and get it, but I told him to keep on driving. Henry was telling us what he admired about Elizabeth Bishop's poem, The Moose, while I studied the dirt beneath my fingernails. The poem was about a nighttime encounter between a busload of passengers and a moose out in the middle of a country road. But it was no ordinary bus, like it was no ordinary moose, not the way Henry described it. What he was talking about was the numinous, where one feels in touch or within the presence of something divine. Maybe that's what I'd been looking for when I asked them to bury me. But what had I seen? Not much more than what they'd seen in those pictures. And I won't say panicking in the dirt was numinous. Then there was the traffic coming and going on the Smoky Park Highway. The discussion had moved on to the CIA, MK Ultra tactics, LSD, and mind scrubbing. I was still sitting there, the middleman, listening to the wind as it blustered through the windows. Their argument centered around mass control. What about self-control? Preservation? I thought about the hammer and all that I had destroyed. Those films had been dead ends, and properly disposed of at that. Then there was the picture I'd left behind. How, if I'd kept it, I'd probably never think of it again. I guess that's what constitutes a haunting. Something gone, still lingering in your mind, or something suddenly there, damp as a cold breath against your neck, or spectral as a luminous figure, suddenly vanishing as soon as he appears in the distance. And who was he? Did you see him too? Struggling with a Super 8 camera? So what if he's gone? Now there were those crooked teeth at the end of the pipe. Sometimes I wake up thinking of them in the middle of the night. The sheets tangled across my legs and arms, my pillow clammy with sweat. It's like those teeth were trying to tell me something. A dark, nervous energy down in the pipe. A voice not quite my own. Voices, in fact. Solemn, yet alive. Eager, yet deadpan as someone stating ingredients from a soup can. Most times I'll just stare into the dark and wait to fall back to sleep. But if the voices are loud enough, I'll get up. Sometimes I'll get dressed, grab a notebook, and drive to the nearest Waffle House on Tunnel Road. In those after-midnight hours, there's always a booth available like the one I sat at with Derek and Henry. It's never dark in the Waffle House, a bright yellow interior. The jukebox is rarely ever on. There's just the music of the chef clanging his spatula and the hiss of cured meat sweating on the grill. Then there's the warmth of the bottomless cup of black coffee and my fine point pen. I'll flex my right hand and wait for the memory of the photograph to slowly drift back into focus, so that I might hear whatever those teeth at the end of the pipe have to say, knowing I've got all night, or rather what's left of it, to write it all down.
That was Can What You Can, written and read by Ian Caskey. This is the first chapter of a book called Voices in the Dirt, a collection of short stories by Ian Caskey, published by Recital Publishing, 2021.
Mr. Ian Caskey, we're very glad to have you back on The Strange Recital.
Thanks for having me back. I'm glad to be here.
This story, Can What You Can, is rather different from your other two stories that we featured on the podcast. Those were After the Rides and More Starlight Please, which are among our more demented literary excursions.
Yes.
But this one is in more of a realistic vein, while still being a bit twisted. Can you say a little about those different styles you write in?
I've always had an active imagination. Some of my stories come from dreams or from a dreaming state of mind, like After the Rides.
Mm-hmm.
Others are inspired by news stories or historical figures and their obsessions and character quirks, like More Starlight Please. And some are from my own personal experiences, like Can What You Can. So I'd say there's the personal realm from where I write and the imaginative realm, and then there are stories that fall somewhere in between.
I enjoy the way your stories veer unexpectedly into strange territory, and I like that you work in those two different styles. The stories in which a young person faces a rather incomprehensible world, particularly when not encountering anything actually outside so-called reality, provide a universal sense that is almost like a backdrop against which the really wild and dark imaginary leaps stand out. Is that contrast a planned effect or more by chance?
I'd say with Can What You Can, it was planned. It was originally titled Afternoon Drive, so I knew I wanted that to be central to the story. I also knew all along it would always be about a live burial, but decided to withhold that information until later in the story. I did try in an earlier draft revealing that in the beginning, and it just felt too sensational, instantly draining from the characters and their environment. So maybe it was more through experimentation than chance I discovered how this story should unfold.
Yeah.
I think this would be a good time to say that you have a book coming out this very month, Voices in the Dirt, a collection of 12 stories published by us, Recital Publishing. And Can What You Can is the first one in the book. You might say it sets the tone and even ends with the narrator talking about sitting in a Waffle House in the middle of the night writing, which leads into the other stories.
Thanks for pointing that out. I wrote Can What You Can specifically for this collection. I wanted an intro story to set up the narrator for all the stories within.
I'm interested in that voice of a young man that provides the spine, you might say, carrying us through the collection. It's easy to imagine that it might be the same person at the center of maybe half the stories. Besides anchoring us in everyday reality, in actual places and times, and meanwhile observing the craziness of the world with black humor, it also gives a sense of melancholy and bewilderment in many of the stories. So here's the old question. How autobiographical is it?
Well, the first and last story in the collection are very close to nonfiction, where all the other stories in between are the gooey good stuff of fiction, containing multitudes of personal truths through varied distortions.
Well, back to Can What You Can. These three guys seem to be an interesting mix of blue-collar and college intellectual, sort of rural American art punks. I can't say I've read or seen characters quite like this before. They're not stereotypes. What was your inspiration?
The inspiration comes primarily from my own work life on various job sites. I remember working on a luxury high-rise door installation job, similar to the one in Funerals for Animals, another story in the collection, and finding out almost everyone on the work crew was either a college dropout, like myself at the time, or a college graduate. Also, a lot of my early writing was inspired by Larry Brown's book, Joe, and Richard Ford's collection of short stories, Rock Springs.
Yes.
I started thinking, how would my own life experiences translate into stories like those? And it's from that I started to see these characters evolve.
Tell me if I'm way off base here, but one thought I had about the main character's need to be buried alive and how it didn't result in anything numinous, as the story says, but rather in terms that we sometimes hear from mythologists like Robert Bly or Martin Shaw. It's an example of vertical travel. They talk about the need, in order to find balance, to not just always look upwards and climb toward light, but also to consciously descend, go down into inner darkness and grief, dwell in the swamp or in the ashes, or in this case, in a grave. Upward is spirit, downward is soul. Any thoughts about this?
I've never heard of vertical travel, but it does ring true for this story. I think the main character felt trapped in the current construct of his life and was trying to find a way out. His initial attempts being to film mock suicides of himself. There's a part in the story about his going from death simulations to death approximations, and this felt key to me in terms of understanding his progression.
Mm-hmm.
If you're sick of living, then maybe you have to die figuratively in some way to find something worth living for.
Mm-hmm.
In his case, it was to become a writer.
Well, I imagine some writers, given the premise of these guys burying their friend alive as if it's all fun, like extreme sports on TV, would have given in to the temptation to turn it into a story of death, accusations of murder, subplots of girlfriend jealousy or secret crimes, maybe a courtroom drama at the end, or some sort of bloody revenge. Thank you for resisting that temptation.
Yes.
Or was it never a temptation?
Well, this was a very personal story for me, so I don't think it was a temptation, though I do sometimes love being extreme in my writing, but this story didn't seem to want to go in that direction. I always felt it should be a somewhat quiet story with a loud resonance, a genuine portrayal of a young man struggling to find his place in the world.
So, about your newly published collection, Voices in the Dirt, how long has it been in the works?
Some of these stories are as old as 10 years, and some written within the last year or so. And some were written really fast, and others took years to write.
And what about your launch plans?
I have an event lined up for late January 2022. The place is yet to be announced. I'll be posting further details on my website, iancaskey.com, or you can follow me on Instagram at iancaskey33. But I'm excited about this event. I've got a Q&A lined up with filmmaker Amos Poe and some music from a premier New York band, the Terror Babies. Should be some wacky, scary fun.
Indeed. Our listeners can go to recitalpublishing.com to find out more about the book and how to get a copy. Any day now, it will be available at many booksellers online and available for order at bookstores.
Do you have other writing in progress now?
Yeah, I've got a couple ideas for a novel brewing and some more short stories on the way.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks for joining us today, Ian.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And may your book sell 1 million.
Now that would be something.
1 million? How are we going to keep up with that? The mimeograph machine will break down. We'll run out of staples.
Oh, yeah. I never thought of that.
This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was an excerpt of Red Vapor, Yellow Door by Frenemas. This is episode 21121.